But these things have I told you, that when the time shall come, ye may remember that I have told you of them.
The UN has expressed fears of a full-scale war as the deadly conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinians continues for a third day. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Palestinian militants that this was just the beginning, threatening to strike with blows they haven't dreamed of. Tonight, President Biden said he had spoken to Mr. Netanyahu and said he hoped the violence would end sooner rather than later.
Police in Haiti say 2 Haitian Americans and more than 20 Colombians are behind the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. Colombia's government says early investigations suggest that some of the men involved were retired members of its military. Moïse was shot dead during a raid at his home on Wednesday.
And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give its reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and thou shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. This text catapults us to a time in Earth's history where God executes his judgments. Therefore, the premise of this series was to bring you to this point, because it is important for us to know what events usher in God's wrath. If we could pinpoint this event, then maybe we would be in a position to avoid his wrath. And his wrath is the 7 last plagues. Matthew 24 reads, "And ye shall hear of wars, and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." These verses indicate that just before the judgments of God and the return of Christ, specific events will be manifested on earth, which are wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes in diverse places. These events are transpiring today on the earth, but verse 6 is very instructive. It states that though these events are taking place, the end is not yet. The word "the end" translates to telos, which means the conclusion of an act. So Matthew is telling us, though we see these signs are not the conclusion of the act. The question should be asked, then what is the conclusion of the act? Luckily for us, the book of Revelation gives us the answer. And it reads, Revelation 13 verse 12, "And he exercised all power of the first beast before him," speaking of America, "and caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast." This beast or kingdom, as we have learned in previous videos, is none other than the papal power. Again it reads, "And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven out of the earth in the sight of men, and deceive them that dwell on the earth by the means of these miracles, which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had a womb by a sword and did live." So here we discovered that America is going to lead the world to worship the first beast or kingdom, which is Rome. But how? The Bible explains that he maketh fire to come down from heaven. And it is by these means that all men, or the entire earth, is deceived into accepting the image or the mark of the beast. What is this fire that deceives the whole world? As it is the event that ushers us into the conclusion of the act, which leads us to God's judgment. In the second video of this series, we dealt with Job, and we will revisit an event that took place with him. This event should help us to understand what is this fire that deceives the entire world. The book of Job reads, "While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and had burnt up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them." We should note that Job's servant did not accredit God with this calamity, for he said, "The fire of God," not the fire from God. Though it may seem confusing, of and from denotes different things. From refers to the origin of things, whereas of is commonly used in possessive structures. Still confused? Then let's break it down. It reads the fire from God, showing the origin of this fire. The fire of God, which shows the fire that is outside of human control, which is not necessarily derived from God. Still confused? Then this illustration would be a nail in a sure place. In insurance, there's a clause called the Act of God clause. This does not mean that the event or act was from God, but that the event or act was outside the control of man. In terms of insurance, an act of God is an act of nature that could not have been foreseen or avoided. It describes an event. These events can be lightning, fires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc. So in essence, Job's servant was saying that what had taken place was a natural disaster. From this, we can conclude that the fire of Revelation 13 is or are natural disasters. But wait, the Bible says that America maketh fire to come down from heaven. Is the Bible implying that America has power to control natural disasters? Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done.
Bloomfield, Michigan, 1942. As World War II rages across several continents, acclaimed architect and eventual designer of the St. Louis Arch, Eero Saarinen, is secretly enlisted by the United States military to work for a new clandestine organization. Its name? The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, or as it is known today, the CIA.
The fact that Eero Saarinen was in the OSS designing weapon systems during World War II, and at a time when the OSS was looking into ways to weaponize weather, makes his whole connection to the design of the St. Louis Arch extremely interesting. Now, that isn't to say I believe it can control the weather, but it does open the door to the idea that it might have been one of the things Saarinen was out to achieve.
While at the OSS, Saarinen designed buildings and weapon systems, many of which were never completed or built. Is it possible he later used these secret plans to engineer the St. Louis Arch, creating something that can actually control or perhaps harness the weather?
Controlling the weather is the ultimate superweapon. It's even more powerful than the atomic bomb. So if Eero Saarinen was involved in analyzing and studying the possibility of weather modification, and you put all those factors together, and I think you have a guy that basically conducted a big, giant weather modification experiment with the St. Louis Arch.
Weather as a weapon? There are some who think the idea is not as preposterous as it seems, especially when considering that even today, many world governments are pouring millions of dollars into research designed to manipulate weather.
I think weather modification has definitely been an ongoing endeavor of governments all over the world for decades. St. Louis Arch appears to be an experiment in weather modification. The HARP device appears to be an experiment in weather modification. Who knows what the Russians or the Chinese are doing? There's some sort of technology out there.
There's been lots of work in the field of weather control, using silver iodide inside of thunderstorms to decrease the size of hail. That goes on in many parts of the world to alleviate that problem. They're always firing rockets into the atmosphere in China to manipulate the weather. But is this a good idea?
You wonder if you could steer a tornado. What would it take? Even a nuclear weapon might just nudge it, if even that.
One challenge with that is your shock wave is going to be hard to focus, perhaps, and it might cause the damage you were hoping to avoid with the tornado. I would be looking at how much can I control or change local pressures in the atmosphere near and around the tornado.
These are forces at work that could wipe out major cities. And we're finding out every day new things that we've never seen before. So maybe the lesson learned here is we shouldn't meddle with forces that we don't really understand, because we may not like the result.
In 1946, Irving Langmuir and Vincent Schaefer discovered that they could create ice crystals inside of a supercooled cloud, and they could make snow. They could create it. That's a pretty big deal. Because if you can make snow, we've shown in the past that if we can make snow or we can change the weather, we can affect whole battles. We can change where things happen. We can change how things happen. We can change how battles play out. And if you do it on purpose, technically you're weaponizing weather, right? There was an Operation Popeye in the 70s. It was a highly classified program where clouds would get seeded with silver iodide and lead iodide. And that could extend monsoon periods by an average of a month, 30 to 45 days. And they used it in Southeast Asia during 1967 to 1972, which you might recognize as when we were in Vietnam. So this was a way for the United States to try and weaponize the weather. They spent 5 years and $21.6 million seeding clouds all over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All they were trying to do? Mess up military supply routes. Then the ENMOD came out, the Environmental Modification Convention, which is an international treaty that the military and other hostile use of environment modification techniques is no longer allowed. They don't want to have widespread, long-lasting, severe effects on the Earth from military modification of the weather. This came out in 1977 in Geneva, and it entered into law, or international treaty really, in October of 1978. So since then, we haven't really been allowed to mess with the weather militarily. That being said, we still do mess with it, and we probably will continue to do so as we learn more about it. Many countries seed their clouds. Entire cities in China seed clouds. China has a weather modification department where they employ and train 32,000 people using more than 12,000 anti-aircraft guns and rocket launchers, in addition to about 30 planes to shoot silver iodide into the clouds. That sounds kind of like the 19th century Americans, doesn't it?
What could be their reasoning or even their goal in weaponizing the weather? Revelation 13 implies that this is done so that the image of the beast will be enforced. So America must create natural disasters. That is what aids in the setting up of the image of the beast. And from previous videos, we know that the image of the beast is the legislation of Sunday worship, legalizing that specific day as a day of rest and reflection, a day of healing for mankind and the environment. If these things be true, then should we not be able to be seeing these strategies being set up today?
You know, we were
So I think that's propaganda.
Look what we did. We got Trump out. I am 100% going to say it, and I 100% believe it, that if it wasn't for CNN, I don't know that Trump would have got voted out.
Our focus was to get Trump out of office, right? Without saying it, that's what it was, right? So our next thing is going to be for climate change awareness.
Do you think it's going to be just like a lot of like fear, like climate?
Yeah, fear sells. Fear sells.
Chester also believes that in the current news cycle, there is, quote, COVID fatigue. Chester saying that CNN has a game plan to fix that fatigue.
I think there's just like a COVID fatigue. So like whenever a new story comes up, they're going to latch onto it. They've already announced in our office that once the public will be open to it, we're going to start focusing mainly on climate. Climate, like global warming, and like that's going to be our next like I don't know, like what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be our focus. Like our focus was to get Trump out of office, right? Without saying it, that's what it was, right? So our next thing is going to be for climate change awareness.
What does that look like?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I have a feeling it's just going to be like constantly showing videos of like decline in ice and weather warming up and like the effects it's having on the economy and really
Who decides that?
The head of the network, like just...
Who's that? Is that Zucker?
Zucker, yeah. I imagine that he's got his council and they've all like discussed like where they think...
So that's like the next...
pandemic like story like that will beat to death, but that one's got longevity, you know what I mean? It's not like there's a definitive ending to the pandemic, or like it'll taper off to a point that it's not a problem anymore. Probably think it's going to take years, so they'll probably be able to milk that for quite a bit,
So climate change overload.
Be prepared, it's coming. Stories like right now.
So we have seen from the horse's mouth, the CNN technical director was caught stating that their new agenda is already planned, and it is to propagate the next big pandemic, which is climate change. It is my view that when this happens, weather weapons will be used to induce horrendous climate events in an attempt to sell fear. This will lead to the setting up of the image of the beast, and it was all planned years in advance, and it is now that the powers that be are getting their opportunity to implement what was planned.
Who made billions out of creating super clunky corporate software. What you didn't realize is that Bill Gates doesn't think of himself that way. Bill Gates doesn't think of himself as some guy who got super rich making bad software. Bill Gates thinks of himself as God, in control of the solar system. And that's why Bill Gates is now backing something called sun-dimming technology that would reflect sunlight out of the Earth's atmosphere, causing global cooling. Ooh, that's not fraught with risks. You thought gain-of-function research on pathogens was dangerous. Try that. But that doesn't stop Harvard University. Its scientists are testing that technology by spewing calcium carbonate dust into the atmosphere. So we're learning more now about the sad toll of the corona lockdowns in this country. According to Joe Biden, we could get another round of lockdowns. These for a crisis that's every bit as bad as the coronavirus, maybe worse. That crisis, of course, says Joe Biden, is climate change.
Today, I'm pleased to announce a team that will lead my administration's ambitious plan to address the existential threat of our time, climate change. Folks, we're in a crisis. Just like we need to be a unified nation in response to COVID-19, we need a unified national response to climate change. And from this crisis, from these crises, I should say, we need to seize the opportunity to build back and build back better than we were before.
If we continue on our current path, we will face the collapse of everything that gives us our security. food production, access to fresh water, habitable ambient temperature, and ocean food chains. And if the natural world can no longer support the most basic of our needs, then much of the rest of civilization will quickly break down. Please make no mistake. Climate change is the biggest threat to security that modern humans have ever faced. I don't envy you the responsibility that this places on all of you and your governments.
German lawmakers got a furious reaction for suggesting COVID restrictions could be the template for fighting climate change. Karl Lauterbach sent out his views in an opinion piece for a newspaper.
There will never be a vaccine against CO2, so we need measures for tackling climate change that are similar to the restrictions of personal freedom in the pandemic.
The Social Democratic Party MP, who's also an epidemiologist, admitted his idea is unlikely to ever happen, but his views sparked a firestorm on social media.
To this end, pretty much everything that is deemed not climate-friendly could be banned.
The struggle for freedom will never end. Lauterbach is already proposing lockdown-like measures to combat climate change. Let's enjoy the festive season and gather strength for the demonstrations and resistance against state violence in 2021.
At about the same time the COVID lockdowns end, the lockdown for climate change begins. Since we have been so willing to give up our freedoms, lockdowns will now be routine.
So we see what is coming. The fulfillment of Revelation 13. And when the image of the beast is set up, then Matthew 24 verse 9 will be fulfilled. This begins the conclusion of the act, or the end. For Matthew reads, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake." So those who will stay faithful to God and the Bible will be hated by those who submit to the dictates of the state and accept the image of the beast. But Matthew verse 14 states the following, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." When this gospel is preached to all the world, mankind will be given the opportunity to hear and accept, or hear and reject. And at the end of it all those who reject the gospel of salvation, these shall fall under the judgments of God. And the Bible says, those that destroy the earth, God also will destroy them.